Greetings and welcome to another Diamond Dave retrospective in which I, Diamond Dave, shall be reviewing my work on YouTube. In this one, I shall be reviewing my 2012 film Big Bad Dave The Dark Path, which serves as a prequel to Enforcer Butch and an origin story for the Big Bad Dave character as featured in Enforcer Butch. So back in 2010, after I made Enforcer Butch, which was a remake of Street Hero and a reboot of the Big Bad Dave character, I had in my mind, even just after making Enforcer Butch, I had in my mind the idea of an origin story for the Big Bad Dave character in this new Enforcer Butch timeline. And I wanted to tell a story that could go back in time before Enforcer Butch and show the events leading up to how the events of Enforcer Butch happened and how Big Bad Dave became Big Bad Dave. So in the fall of 2010, at the end of that year, I uploaded this teaser trailer to my channel.
If I take these tablets, I will die. Everything I had ever worked for was taken away from me by no some scum of the earth. This man who took not only one life, but the life of an unborn child who never had the chance to live. Because of him, my unborn child never had the opportunity to see the world, to make a life for himself. Something has emerged, something stronger. I will not take these tablets. I will not kill your gods. I will not submit. I will not. This is not the end. This is only the beginning.
So this teaser was uploaded 6 months after Enforcer Butch. It was in December of 2010 that this teaser was uploaded, because after Enforcer Butch, I started to develop the story in my head about Big Bad Dave's origins. So the purpose of this teaser trailer, this brief teaser, was to allude to and to foreshadow that in the future I was going to make a prequel film that was going to explain the backstory and origins of Big Bad Dave and show how he became the big, all-powerful, evil crime boss as he is seen in Enforcer Butch. But it wasn't until about a year and a half after this teaser was uploaded that I finally got round to making it into a proper full film. I had a couple of reasons why, because I had other projects that I wanted to work on, like Vigilante, which I've already covered in the previous episode of Diamond Dave Retrospectives if you want to check it out. So I had other projects that I wanted to work on like that, and I also had a few things going on in my personal life that was making it difficult for me to be able to make regular content on my channel, but I digress. So, as you could see in this teaser, we see a man who's obviously Big Bad Dave before he becomes Big Bad Dave, sitting there contemplating suicide and mentioning about losing his unborn child and presumably his wife as well. I wanted this teaser to show Big Bad Dave originally, before the events of Enforcer Butch, before he became this monster as seen in Enforcer Butch, that he was just an ordinary civilian, just an ordinary guy, but through because of a very tragic, undisclosed, horrific event, he snaps, goes insane, and then turns evil, and then becomes the ruthless, evil, powerful crime boss as he is seen in Enforcer Butch. I wanted to do a prequel for the Big Bad Dave character because I like prequels. I think prequels are a very fascinating narrative device if used correctly for stories. I like the concept that you see something like a film or a TV show, a book, or even a computer game, and it already establishes the setting and the story. But then years after this said piece of fiction is shown, the somebody decides to make a prequel and go back in time to show the events that you haven't seen yet that take place before the events that you've already seen, like the Star Wars trilogy, for example, the original trilogy. Whenever the first Star Wars films came out, that Darth Vader comes across as this all-powerful, pure evil character. But then years later, whenever George Lucas decided to make the prequels and go back in time, and you see the prequels, for better or worse, you're going to view the original trilogy in a different way as opposed to how they were originally seen because of the new story points as made in the prequels. So that's what I was trying to go for in this one. And I was heavily inspired by a famous graphic novel called The Killing Joke by Alan Moore, which shows a potential backstory to the Joker, a tragic backstory that tries to explain why he became insane and turned into the ultimate supervillain that we all know and love today in the Batman universe. I really wanted to give some substance, character substance to Big Bad Dave, because in Enforcer Butch, he's just straight up the villain. He appears, he barks orders to his henchmen, and just spends the film doing evil things. However, I wanted to give him a human side, which is why I wanted to make a prequel to Enforcer Butch to show Big Bad Dave as this ordinary, vulnerable human being before he became this monster, just like other villains in pop culture who have been given background origin stories, like the Joker from The Killing Joke, which was a massive inspiration for this particular film, and Darth Vader from Star Wars, etc., etc. It helps the audience see these characters in a different perspective, and it just adds more character layers and development to those characters. Another reason why I wanted to make an origin story to Big Bad Dave is because I see him as my main flagship character for this channel, because he's my most recurring character out of the other characters that I've done. And I just felt that, having already used him in several films by this point in time, I wanted to give him a good origin story that could do him justice, just as my own tribute to my own character. And simply put, I wanted to humanise Big Bad Dave. I didn't want him to just be this evil villain as he is seen in Enforcer Butch. I want to show that he was once a good man. This film is a tragic tale of how a good man, through the difficulties of life, becomes evil. I was talking about Vince Carter in my previous retrospective, Vigilante. Vince Carter is the main antagonist of that film. He's supposed to be pure evil for no reason. But for this project, I wanted to go back to Big Bad Dave and give him that human side, give him a sympathetic and tragic backstory that could help not only humanise him a bit and make him a more tragic figure, but also make him a more three-dimensional character. Another reason why I wanted to show Big Bad Dave's origins was to give more context to the relationship between him and Butch, the protagonist of Enforcer Butch, because Big Bad Dave and Butch do not meet until the very end of the film, and we only have a very brief, temporary, on-screen relationship. We don't share that many scenes. We only meet up briefly, have a brief exchange of dialogue, and it's implied through the brief dialogue that we have together, that Butch knows exactly who Big Bad Dave is, and the way Ruben performs that particular line implies that Butch has got something personal against Big Bad Dave. And at the end of the film, Butch has Big Bad Dave cornered. He gets the better of Big Bad Dave, and Big Bad Dave is disarmed and rendered harmless. And then he punches me and I fall to the ground. And then Big Bad Dave tries to plead with him, "You're just as bad as me, I'm defenseless." But Butch kills Big Bad Dave in cold blood anyway. But Butch was given a choice. In Enforcer Butch, it says, as one of his priorities and his assignments, get Big Bad Dave dead or alive. So given that he had disarmed Big Bad Dave and rendered him harmless, Butch had the choice to spare Big Bad Dave. Given that he was the hero, he could have shown Big Bad Dave mercy and be the better man and just simply arrest him instead. But he decides to kill Big Bad Dave instead. So I wanted to try and give a bit of exposition as to why Butch chose to be ruthless and just kill Big Bad Dave in cold blood instead of arresting him for his crimes. But I'm going to expand on that exposition and backstory between these two characters later on in this review. Now, regarding the real life circumstances in which I made this film, Big Bad Day of the Dark Path, this film is actually a piece of college coursework, because in the fall of 2011 I enrolled in my local college to pursue higher education in filmmaking. I chose to do a high national diploma course in creative media production to hone in on my skills as a filmmaker and to improve on what I already knew about filmmaking. Because in 2008 I had left secondary school with my academic credentials. I had my GCSEs and I also had my A-levels in media. So in between those 3 years, between 2008 and 2011, during those 3 years, I made all my films for my channel in my own free spare time, because apart from making movies and socializing with my friends, I didn't really have much to do in my personal life. So I decided to go back to school, so to speak, by enrolling in higher education at my local college and choosing to do this HND, because I wanted to, as I said, improve my knowledge on what I already knew about filmmaking, improve on my skills as a filmmaker, learn new things about filmmaking, but also meet like-minded people in this course and befriend them and potentially make new filmmaking partnerships out of these new friends who I could meet at college, who in the future could help me in my own enterprises and future projects. And by enrolling in this course, this also gave me more opportunities to make films as well, because obviously this being a filmmaking course, making films was part of the criteria. So this opened even more doors and opportunities for me to make new films for this channel. So now I find myself making films in academia circumstances once again. For the first time since 2008, I was making a film in the classroom. Fortunately, the lecturer allowed us to choose the story that we wanted to tell in each of our films for our coursework, so we were given freedom over what we wanted to make a film about. So, given that for about a year and a half, by this time I had this idea in my head for Big Bad Dave's origin story. This was a perfect opportunity to seize and to use as a means to make that idea of Big Bad Dave's backstory become a film. Now, as I said in my first Diamond Dave retrospective, there are pros and there are cons to making a film in academic circumstances in a school environment. And I'm going to try and articulate these pros and cons as best as I can, so bear with me. The pros are that you're definitely going to get it made because you don't have a choice. You have to make a film, and all of your classmates know that. And that automatically means that you already have a team, because as a class, we all helped each other out in our own respective projects. For example, I got one of my classmates to be the cameraman for this film, and a couple of other classmates to act in this film alongside me, even though they were doing their own projects at the same time, and vice versa. I helped them out with their pieces of film coursework too. So we were all a team in that way. When you're making a film in academic circumstances, it's definitely going to happen because you have to get it done, and you're in a class full of other like-minded people who too want to get their own work done. So as a class, we all would work and help each other out in our own respective pieces of film work. Whereas if you're trying to make a film in your free time, it's not as structured as that. Unfortunately, you have to ring them up and organize it, and unfortunately, if you're doing it in your free time, things could come up which will stop the person you need to help you make the film from being able to do what they're supposed to do. So it's slightly easier to get a film made in academic circumstances as opposed to trying to get it done in your free time when you're trying to organize it all by yourself and trying to get all these people to be available at the same time, depending on their own timetables. But in the classroom, the teacher tells you that you have to do it, and you're going to do it because everybody's in the same boat when it comes to making a film in school circumstances. Unfortunately, there are cons to that as well. You are limited in what you can do because you have a time limit. You're given a time limit of how much time you can spend making your film in academic circumstances, because you have deadlines to make and to adhere to. Whenever you're, especially in higher education, the pressure is bigger in higher education than it normally would be. You have to meet the deadlines, otherwise you will lose points. You have to get the film all recorded, edited, and all finished by a certain deadline. So unfortunately, the time constraints do lead to you having to cut out things that you could otherwise put in if you were making it in your spare time. And I feel, unfortunately, this project does suffer because of the circumstances in which it was made in, but I'm going to elaborate on that later on in this retrospective. On top of that, obviously, being given a film to do in a certain period of time and having to get it done, all done by a certain deadline, there's a whole load of other things you need to do, especially in a higher education course like an HND, because in this HND that I was doing, I not only was I doing film, but I was doing television production studies, photojournalism, and a lot of theory shit. There was a lot of theory and written work that I had to do as well. I had to write the script, obviously, that was a given, but I also had to write up essays about how I did it and write about the technicalities of how I did it. I had to write these big, long theories as to add on to my coursework. And I also had other parts of the course to adhere to. I had to do stuff on the photojournalism side of things, do different assignments for that, and I also had to do a documentary piece as well as a fiction piece. So Big Bad Day of the Dark Path was my fiction piece, but I also had another film to make in the same deadline, in the same time limit, a documentary piece. And on top of all that, I also had to provide a commentary on a football match as part of the television production section of the HND. So this high national diploma course that I was doing at college had a lot of content in it, and I had a lot of very hard work to do, including making Big Bad Day of the Dark Path. So I'm amazed in hindsight, all these years later, how I managed to make this whilst I had all this other shit to do simultaneously on a time limit and have a deadline to meet in order to get my pass in my first year of college. It was a very stressful time, and unfortunately, there was a lot of lore and story and exposition that I had to cut out of the finished version of this film just for the sake of getting it handed in for evaluation. So I'm sorry if I went off on a bit of a tangent there, but I'm trying to give you an idea of what it's like to make a film in academic circumstances and just all the pressures and things I had to face at the time making this particular film, and why I feel the quality of the finished product does suffer a bit as a result from those circumstances. So, because the finished film was over 10 minutes in length, whenever I took the film home with me on a USB after finishing my first year of college, I had to split it into two separate halves because of that 10-minute time rule that YouTube had at the time, that I wasn't allowed to upload videos that exceeded 10 minutes. So I had to upload Big Bad Day of the Dark Path in two separate parts. So here we go. This is the origin story of Big Bad Dave, Big Bad Dave the Dark Path. Part 1 was uploaded on the 10th of May 2012, and Part 2 was uploaded the following day on the 11th of May 2012. So I deliberately opened the film with clips from Enforcer Butch, just to reinforce that this is a prequel to that film, just to show the events in the present, and now a flashback to 10 years before this happened. There's a subtle reference there by including the book of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in this film, a bit of symbolism of what is to come later on in the film regarding my character's development. So here is a pre-Big Bad Dave character. Big Bad Dave is a normal civilian, and as you can see, he's quite nonplussed. Because I was making it in academic circumstances, I was required to be as artistic as possible in regards to how I shot the film and directed it, so I thought that this shot was a good one in terms of the silhouette and the lighting. So the way I made this film is what I like to call silent storytelling. As you can see so far, there is no dialogue whatsoever, and there's very little dialogue in this film. It's sort of more show and not tell. Tell the story through silent visuals to give the audience an impression of what is going on through actions and emotion. Basically, the sequence you saw there at the beginning of me going into the room, drinking wine and writing a letter was a grieving man, a pre-Big Bad Dave character, writing a letter of invitation to his friends for dinner. And I pick up a jar that is supposed to house the remains, the ashes of my recently deceased wife who was murdered. And whenever I press it to my head, we go to a flashback sequence of a much happier pre-Big Bad Dave character sort of having an affectionate scene with his wife. The girl who played my wife was in the same college class as me. She did the same HND as I did. So as I said earlier, we all helped each other out in our own respective projects as a class because we all had the same coursework to do to produce a film, each and every one of us. We all helped each other out in different roles, whether to be cameramen or fellow actors or actresses. So basically, the visual storytelling here in this scene is that my wife in this film is pregnant and she's handing me an ultrasound scan, and we're both celebrating and being very happy and affectionate about the situation that is about to go horribly wrong. Now, there is a similar incident as to Vigilante regarding my height. The girl who played my wife is much taller than I am, and as I said in Vigilante, I'm short. I'm short on the arse. So, in order to make the scene more convincing, she literally had to crouch all the way down to my head level because originally I was just looking up at her like this for this embracing scene. So again, like the girl from Vigilante, um, this other girl had to crouch down to be at my head level just to make it a bit more authentic and to make me not look as short as I really am. So what I do like about this film is how it's told visually, mostly without too much dialogue or exposition. It's like watching a silent movie in a way. Now, originally, there were a couple of more scenes that were recorded between myself and the girl who plays my wife in this film that actually included dialogue in which we speak to each other. But because this film was made in academic circumstances, there were rules that I had to adhere to. The film could only be a certain length of time. I could only, I had to really abridge the film, so to speak, because I was, as part of the class rules, the film could only be a certain length of time. It couldn't be too short, but it couldn't be too long either. So there were scenes that we did record in which myself and my on-screen wife speak to each other celebrating that we're about to have a child. But because of those rules that I had to make the film a certain length of time, those scenes had to be removed to continue accelerating the story and to adhere to the HND rules.
Margaret! No!
Okie dokie, so there's quite a bit to talk about that sequence that you just saw there of my wife getting murdered, because obviously this is the spark that sort of turns this ordinary man into an evil criminal. Tragedy. The chap who played the mugger who shot my wife, he too was another classmate of mine from the same HND class, so it was great that we were all a team as a class because we were all on the same boat. We all had to make films and we were all helping each other out. So in my original vision for this film, there was going to be a bit more exposition to this scene. Basically, this pre-Big Bad Dave character, his job was a bank manager, hence the formal dressing and the fact that I'm carrying a briefcase. I'm supposed to be a bank manager. And it was supposed to be implied that because of my job as a bank manager, I had quite a lot of money, and this criminal chose to target my house in order to steal money that I amassed from my job. So he goes in, kills my wife. I overhear the gunshot and I run back to her. But on the way back, I brush past him and we both meet each other's eyes. I see his face, which will, me recognizing him, will lead on to what's going to happen next. Now, I really try my best here in terms of my acting to try and act as a man who is totally devastated and traumatized and grieving over the corpse of my wife and trying to cry and have a breakdown over her. Now, I do like to consider myself an actor, but I've never been trained as an actor. I'm sort of what they call a hack actor. I sort of make it all up as I go along. I've never really been trained in acting, but I just sort of, in all of my films, I've improvised my acting. So this was me trying to portray a legitimate breakdown over the sight of my wife who had recently just been murdered, and by extension, my unborn child is dead too. So I cannot cry at will, but kudos to actors who can cry at will, because it's a very, very difficult thing to do. I did try to legitimately cry for this scene, but I just couldn't. I mean, it's amazing how actors can use their organs, their body parts to contribute to their acting, such as being able to activate their tear ducts to cry at will, but that's a skill I myself do not have. So in order to try and come across that I was legitimately crying, I just sort of really went like this and doing inhales of breath to really try and come across that I was actually crying, sort of wincing a lot and breathing heavily and trying to look as sad as I possibly could whilst cradling the girl in my hands. I actually had inspiration from Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 for that particular shot of me crying over my wife, because there's a scene in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2, there's a flashback sequence in which Professor Snape, as played by the late great Alan Rickman, discovers Harry's dead mother, and because he was in love with her, he cradles her in his arms crying. So I was literally thinking of that scene from that film when I was acting out this sequence. Later on, a few days later after we made this scene, the girl who played my wife, who had just been shot, she actually told me that as I was holding her in my arms and pretending to cry, she told me that she was pissing herself laughing when I was holding her. Obviously, I didn't notice this at the time because I was too busy trying to act being all sad, but she was actually laughing a lot when I was cradling her in my arms because she thought it was funny. So yeah, it was just quite amusing that she just told me she was pissing herself laughing whenever I was really trying to act out this very serious, dark, and very tragic scene.
You murdered my wife! Ah!
What have I done? So this scene is basically me avenging my wife by killing the man who murdered my wife. So there was supposed to be a bit of time lapse in the story here. I have gone through the grieving process. My wife's funeral happened, and now I'm seeking out to get the man who killed her, because clearly the criminal who killed her was not penalised for what he did. And I recognise him from our brief altercation whenever I run into him, and we both stare each other down after he shoots her, and before I can chase after him, I then go back into the house and find my wife dead. So that's why I'm able to recognise the man who kills my wife in this. I was going for a horror movie kind of atmosphere for this particular sequence, sort of like Friday the 13th, in which I'm stalking him in the woods as he walks deeper into them. I'm armed with this big shovel, and I'm stalking him from behind the trees, ready to jump out and attack. And I remember when I was playing about with the camera before we set the scene up, I recorded a brief piece of footage of a squirrel jumping and bouncing around, and I decided to leave that in just for arty reasons, I suppose, just to make the atmosphere a bit, just to add something to the atmosphere of the scene. And I remember one of my classmates who was there at the time helping us make the scene, he pointed at the squirrel and said, "It's fucking jumping! It's fucking jumping!" As squirrels do, because they jump and bounce about, but this classmate of mine was quite fascinated by it bouncing about. Anyway, I digress. So the bit that I run out from behind the tree screaming, swinging the spade to strike the guy who kills my wife, that was directly taken from Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining. There's a scene in that film in which a man is quietly walking into the hotel and looking around him, and then after this quiet sequence, all of a sudden Jack Nicholson jumps out from behind a pillar screaming, wielding an axe in a similar fashion that I am wielding the spade, and he impales the guy with the axe. So this was a deliberate shot for shot remake of that scene from The Shining, because I thought it would be cool. And then I avenge my wife. I get my own justice whenever I bludgeon the guy who killed her to death. And those after effects, both in the scene that the man shoots my wife, the flame and the bullets coming out of the gun, and then the blood and dirt in this scene whenever I'm beating him to death with the spade, that was kindly, those after effects were kindly put in by my lecturer, because whenever I showed him the footage in class, I told my teacher that I wanted these effects to make it more authentic, both for the scene that the man shoots the girl and for this scene whenever I beat the man to death with the spade. And I didn't have the knowledge of After Effects at the time to be able to put those effects in myself, but my teacher who took my course did, so he very kindly took the footage for himself and added in those After Effects for me. He put in the gunfire and the blood and dirt for both those respective scenes, so I'm very grateful to my lecturer for his contribution adding those after effects over those scenes on my behalf. Then I get the spade and dig a shallow grave and bury him in it after what I did. And whenever I go, what have I done? This is whenever I'm starting to go insane, and this is sort of the birth of Big Bad Dave, that this man has become an evil man now through what he's done, and he's about to go insane. And to put a bit more lore, so to speak, and story symbolism, I take the gun that the criminal had, which is supposed to be the same gun that he used to shoot my wife with. I took the gun and take it for myself, and this is supposed to be the same gun that I would later use as Big Bad Dave in Enforcer Butch. Sort of a bit of irony there, that I steal the gun from the criminal who killed my wife, and then I take it for myself, and then years later, whenever my character becomes a criminal, I use that same gun as seen in Enforcer Butch. So a bit of symbolism there in the story, and how my character is slowly developing into a villain. And so after I murder my wife's killer, um, I steal his gun and take it for myself, because there's supposed to be an implication that this is the same gun that Big Bad Dave would use later on in his life as a criminal in Enforcer Butch. So that's just a little Easter egg. Another Easter egg in that particular scene is the coat that I'm wearing in that scene is actually the original Big Bad Dave coat from Street Hero. So a little callback to the original incarnation of the character for me to wear the original Big Bad Dave's coat in this new prequel timeline to Enforcer Butch, which is a remake of Street Hero and the character of Big Bad Dave. So after that flashback of my wife getting killed and me avenging her, we cut back to the present, me grieving. So this is nearing the end of part 1 of Big Bad Dave the Dark Path, and this is whenever Big Bad Dave starts to turn mad, when he starts hearing voices in his head.
Is someone there? Who's here?
I'm all around you.
Why are you talking to me? Where are you?
I'm over here. I'm everywhere.
I can hear you, but I can't see you. Where are you?
Check out the newspaper.
The newspaper. "25-year-old's body found in Castle Park Woods. Belly decomposed. Suspected 10 months. Found possible injuries of blunt blows to the head and back."
So the video sort of abruptly ends there whenever I'm reading the newspaper, because that was the 10-minute time limit rule that YouTube had at the time, so I couldn't continue the story in one video. So this is where it's split into two parts. So now that Big Bad, well, this pre-Big Bad Dave character, now that he's now starting to turn crazy, and we've now established his tragic backstory that his wife and unborn child were killed, we are now going to go to part 2 of Big Bad Dave the Dark Path to witness his transformation into a monster.
You killed him. No! We killed him. What? Don't you remember when your little Margaret was snatched away? The man who murdered her? The shovel? The spade? Jesus Christ! Bingo. Didn't it feel good smashing his cranium in with that shovel? No! I am not a murderer! He deserved it! I am not a taker of life. I am not a murderer! Yes, you are. Yes, you are. You're slowly turning into me. I am the epitome of all the hates that you've ever had. I'm becoming alive. It can't be real. You're in my head. This is not happening. It's an illusion. I'm no illusion. Though we share the same body, we're not the same person, and I'm very, very real. I'm the one who made you what you are now. I made you a real man. Because of me, your wife was avenged. Open up. Let me take over, and you'll become the man you always wanted to be. What kind of man? A murderer? A taker of life? A man with power and respect. A blight upon the land, and anyone who opposes us shall suffer and die. I don't want to be that kind of person. It is inevitable. You will become me, and soon many, many more lives will be taken by our hands.
So I'm quite proud of that particular scene, this split personality. There is a subtle foreshadowing at the very beginning of part 1 of this film, because there's a brief shot of the novel Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, just to sort of put a bit of symbolism and foreshadowing there about Big Bad Dave's personality. So basically, after murdering his wife's killer and about 10 months of isolation and drinking, my character is now finally snapped and gone insane, and has now developed a second personality, split personality disorder, I think it's called, or multiple personality disorder. That is what I was trying to convey in this scene, that the good man who was, is now trying to fight against the evil that is now awakened within him, the evil that will soon be the trench coat wearing gangster Big Bad Dave. So this scene that I'm splitting, snapping in and out, good to evil, constantly talking to myself, my separate personality in the mirror, that was taken from the 2002 Spider-Man movie, in which Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin, as played by Willem Dafoe, is talking to himself in the mirror, and the good half of him is sort of arguing with the evil half as two separate personalities, and that's what I was going for in this scene. That's there are two personalities inside this man's body. The good man, David Williams, as we now know him. Now that's Big Bad Dave's real name. The character in this, David Williams, the good man who is David Williams, arguing against the evil Big Bad Dave, this new evil personality that is being created inside him as a result of the trauma of losing his wife and child, and then the guilt over killing the man who killed his wife and child. I'm actually quite proud of it in terms of my acting. I think I did a pretty good job in that scene. I do have varied feelings about this film in terms of how it turned out, but I am proud of that scene, and that was done all in one take. It's very difficult to do a dialogue sequence all in one go, but that was the one take we did of it, and even if I say so myself, I was able to pull it off quite well. Just this prolonged argument, this inner conflicts that this man is having, the good side in him fighting the evil half. But as we all know in Enforcer Butch, the evil side prevails, and the good man who was David Williams is shrouded by the dark side, Big Bad Dave.
There's blood on my hands. There's blood on my hands. Let's get rid of it. Christ!
Yes, I think we all know I was going for a Shakespearean angle there, the whole Macbeth thing, washing the blood off your hands, etc., etc. I would like to think that it was a reasonable portrayal there. I actually accidentally shattered a glass during that take. Thankfully, by a miracle, I didn't cut myself by accident, but I was just getting so overzealous in my acting, really putting it all into my performance. And whenever I threw the thing down, I did accidentally smash a glass, but the casualties of filmmaking. I'm going to cut out a few scenes here just for pacing purposes, because it's basically just the same thing that I'm pretty much having a breakdown and screaming to myself and gradually turning crazier. So I'll skip to the next scene that I see as relevant to talk about. So this was, I wanted to sort of symbolise dark reflections of oneself, that he looks up and he sees the evil that's inside him looking straight back at him in the mirror. The future version of himself, Big Bad Dave, as we see from Enforcer Butch with the sunglasses and the trench coat. my character is basically being haunted by his future self, sort of transcending time and space, sort of getting into his head and really trying to force him to give in to the darkness and become the evil creature that is looking right back at him in the mirror, the evil version of himself. Now, this was quite an ambitious scene to set up. Originally, we were planning on using a split screen technique to make the scene more authentic and realistic, so that me in my normal blue shirt and normal glasses would simultaneously be able to be in the same shot as the reflection, the Big Bad Dave reflection, in which I'm dressed differently as Big Bad Dave. But we could have done it, but unfortunately my bathroom is very, very small, so it was all about physical space. If we did it in a bigger room, which we didn't have, if we had more space, we could have done the split screen effect, and we did try several attempts to set it up in which we could do a split screen, have two versions of myself in the same shot, but just because of physical space we couldn't achieve that effect. So instead we just shot me separately looking like this, and then cut back to me in a separate shot looking in the mirror as in my Big Bad Dave gear, to give that illusion that I'm looking into the mirror and seeing an evil version of myself. It could have been handled better, but practically we just couldn't do it. And again, we were working on a tight time schedule as well, and it would have taken longer to have edited a split screen effect in post-production had we had the physical space to actually do it.
It's time, David. The time has come to let me out. Let me out. Become me. Become me. Open up and let me take over. Become me.
No! No!
I deny this! I deny it! This isn't happening! No! No! Can you hear me? Can you hear me, David Williams? Go away! Leave me! Leave me! Murderer! Destroyer of life! No! No! I'm not a murderer! Oh, but you are. You are a murderer. If you can hear me, you're going to die! Who are you? What the hell are you? Who am I? What am I? I'm you. I'm your shadow.
Again, just David Williams slowly turning evil. Big Bad Dave is now becoming the dominant personality of this man's mind, and the good man that was David Williams is slowly fading away, and in his place, the evil gangster Big Bad Dave, as we see in Enforcer Butch, is now becoming the dominant personality. It abruptly cuts off there suddenly to me on the phone in this scene coming up, which I'm going to address the content and exposition of after I show it.
How's your son Butch, by the way? I haven't seen him in ages. Is he 10 years old already? Good grief. It only seems like yesterday that me and Margaret were standing there in the church hall and he was being christened, and you declared us as his godparents. Wow. What do you mean he looks up to me? Does he actually look up to me? I can't imagine why. Well, as you say, I suppose I am his godfather and he's my godson. But I'm very proud of Butch. Butch is like the son I never had, really. And I'm very grateful that you appointed me to be his godfather. And Butch is my god.
So, the shocking truth is finally revealed. I do feel in hindsight that this is quite silly. So I really wanted to try and give some depth, character depth, between Big Bad Dave and Butch, and try and give an explanation as to why it was so personal for Butch to face off against me in Enforcer Butch. So, as we have picked up in that conversation, I'm obviously talking to Butch's parents on the phone, who in this universe, in this film, they were very good friends of mine, the parents of Butch from Enforcer Butch, and in this big shocking twist, Big Bad Dave was Butch's godfather. Yeah, it is a bit silly in hindsight, but I just wanted to give some interesting lore to the story and exposition about Big Bad Dave and Butch. And the funny thing is, this film, Big Bad Dave The Dark Path, is supposed to take place 10 years before the events of Enforcer Butch. And from my dialogue in this film, Butch is still a child at 10 years old in this, which means 10 years on in the future in Enforcer Butch, that means that he would have been 20 years old. So I'm not sure what age I'm supposed to be in this film, given that chronologically this takes place decades before Enforcer Butch, and in Enforcer Butch I look the same. Maybe Big Bad Dave just ages very well, who knows. But it is silly because the guy who played Butch in Enforcer Butch is only 2 years younger than I am, so the prospect of me supposedly being the godfather to him in this story is ridiculous. But in the story, Butch is still a child in this timeline, and I'm his godfather. So basically, in this conversation, when the people who I'm talking to they're supposed to be the same people who I'm writing a letter to at the beginning of Big Bad Day of the Dark Path Part 1, in which I'm inviting them round for dinner. And unfortunately, I don't think the story is that strong in that respect, because we don't really know what's going on, and it's taking me to explain it in this retrospective exactly what is happening. Basically, David Williams is now completely turned bad and has now invited Butch's parents over for dinner. which is not going to end well, but I'm going to elaborate on that once we near the end of this film. But again, I was making it in academic circumstances, and there was more exposition and more dialogue recorded to sort of really establish what is going on. But I just had to cut it out. I had to cut most of it out so I could meet the rules of the class that I was doing, and that I wouldn't lose any points for making the film too long. So I had to keep it within a specific length of time, and as I said, I feel the story does suffer because of that.
I'm David Williams. I'm a good man. I can cook. I'm doing this for my friends because they support me. They support me. Margaret may be gone, but I've still got them. I've still got them. Positive, be positive. Your friends are going to have a nice time, and so are you. Ignore it. He's not real. He's not real. He's not real. It's all in my head. It's all in my head. Right, that's it.
And that was it. Fucking Christ. I am not proud of how this film ended. I sort of pulled a Sopranos there, that it's really building up to something and then it just cuts off. Okay, so before I explain the reasons as to why the film ended this way, just to give a bit of context, this is the reason why Butch chose to kill Dave in Enforcer Butch. I mentioned earlier in this review that I wanted to make Big Bad Dave's death in Enforcer Butch more justifiable because Butch had a choice as the hero. He could have been the better man and spared Big Bad Dave and just arrest him as opposed to killing him in cold blood once he disarmed him. But this ending to the film, I wanted to give Butch a justifiable reason as to why he did kill me in Enforcer Butch, because as implied through that lackluster ending, I killed Butch's parents. So basically, yeah, I've already turned full on Big Bad Dave. I've invited Butch's parents round for dinner, and what was supposed to have happened was my character, who has now become Big Bad Dave, flew into a fit of jealous rage because he was jealous of them that they were happy and he wasn't, because he lost his wife and child in such bad circumstances. And then in a fit of jealousy and rage, he murders Butch's parents and then goes on to become the powerful crime lord as seen in Enforcer Butch. And then on Butch's end, that gives Butch the incentive to become the crime fighter and titular enforcer in Enforcer Butch. So yes, Big Bad Dave killed Butch's parents, and then 10 years later in Enforcer Butch, Butch wanted revenge, and once he took on Big Bad Dave, it was his chance to avenge his parents. So I was trying to make if you combine Big Bad Dave, The Dark Path with Enforcer Butch, it's all a big tragic tale of loss, madness, justice, and revenge. So, okay, the reason why the film ended this way was simply down to lack of practical resources. The only two other actors I could get in this film, my two other classmates, were the girl who played my wife, and the guy who murdered my wife. Those were the only two other actors I could get for this film. If I had the time and if I wasn't so pressured in this education time limit to get it all wrapped up by a certain date, I was going to get two other actors to assume the role of Butch's parents, and then we were going to film the scene that I was hosting them dinner, and then I just go nuts and kill them, and then I put the sunglasses on and put on the coat and leave the house, and then it just fades to black. And that's how it was supposed to have ended. That's the ending that it could have had it not been for all the constrictions I had at the time, because not only was I on a time limit to get this film made, I also had a lot of other shit to do at the same time in this course, because not only had I this film to make, I had a documentary film to make, I had to do a football commentary, I had a fuck ton of theory essays to write up, I had to do a lot of written work and theory work and get a lot of essays that had to be submitted on time. They had their own time limits, and I also had the photojournalism part of the course to attend to, so I had a lot to do at the time, all within this period of a few months, including Big Bad Day of the Dark Path, and I'm so sorry both to myself and the audience that I could not give this film the ending that it was supposed to have. So instead of getting this proper, tense, atmospheric scene that shows Big Bad Dave murder Butch's parents and then, ergo, gives Butch the justification to killing Big Bad Dave and Enforcer Butch, instead of that, we just get this very flimsy, last minute, half-hearted text message at the end. He had his closest friends round for dinner that night. Little did they know that it would be their last meal. A monster was born that night. Big Bad Dave. Fade to black. To be concluded in Enforcer Butch. This was not how I wanted this story to be, but I'm going to talk about that now in the final reflections part of the review. So, for the final reflections on Big Bad Day of the Dark Path, this could have been so much more. It really could. I cite it as a massive disappointment, if I have to be honest. I think the acting is very good, even if I say so myself, and I'm very grateful to the others who were involved in this film, like my cameraman, Sam Orr, Anna, who played my wife, and Maddie, who played my wife's killer. I'm grateful for their involvement and how much they helped me out. All three of them were classmates from the same HND course I was doing, so all three of us had our own projects to make and helping each other out. But this was not the story I wanted to tell. Well, it is, but it's only part of the story that I originally envisioned for Big Bad Dave. There was going to be so much more. I just wanted to show much more of the story. I felt I did a decent job in showing his descent into madness and portraying him as a sympathetic figure, that he suffers a horrible tragedy, and about him avenging his wife, but the guilt of killing another man, it creates this evil personality inside him, and then it's a struggle between the good and the bad side, and eventually the bad side obviously takes over. But that was the only that's all that was told. There was so much more I wanted to show in Big Bad Dave's origin story. I wanted to show him kill and I wanted to show him kill Butch's parents properly, to justify and explain the reasons why Butch killed him and Enforcer Butch. But again, I didn't have any extra actors to assume those roles, and we were working in very, very subdued and constricted circumstances with the time limit. But not only that, I wanted to show Big Bad Dave's journey going up through the ranks of the criminal underworld and show him become the leader that he is in Enforcer Butch, showing him gradually be built up from being a petty criminal all the way up to being the big crime boss as he's depicted as being in Enforcer Butch. But I just cannot tell all of that in this. If I wasn't making this film in academic circumstances, I could have told the story much better and show more of the story and put more of what I wanted into it, but it just comes off as very half-hearted in my opinion, and that's just because of the circumstances it was made in. It was made in college circumstances, and I had a lot of rules to adhere to. And I had a lot of other work to do independent of this film. I had a lot of other work on the course to do, which also limited what I could have done with this film. Especially the ending. The ending was just shit. I really did pull a David Chase out of the Sopranos moment there. I build it all up and then it just cuts to nothingness. We just have this little text message alluding to what happened, and then Big Bad Dave kills Butch's parents, and we all know what happens next because we've already seen Enforcer Butch. This is not the prequel I wanted to make. Given that Big Bad Dave is such an important character on my channel in my own little universe, this was not the origin story that would do him justice. But hopefully one day, I could try and remake this prequel and give Big Bad Dave a proper, more fleshed out origin story. But that was it. But I do think that the acting is what I think is what makes it really good, and my utmost gratitude to my classmates who helped me on this project, from the cameraman and my two fellow actors. But it was a stressful time, and whenever I joined the course and was told that as part of the coursework we had to make a film, I sort of jumped on the bandwagon and used it as the opportunity, use it as an opportunity to tell the Big Bad Dave origin story that I had been wanting to make since 2010, but unfortunately it just did not, because of the circumstances it was made in, it just didn't turn out the way it was supposed to be. So I know this has been a very long video, quite a long retrospective, but there was a lot to cover, and talk about in this particular one because of the time it was made and the context of it. So that was Big Bad Dave The Dark Path. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe, and stay tuned next time when I will be reviewing my summer 2012 action movie, Brothers in Arms. Until then, take care and be lucky.